everyone. Welcome to the first webinar on integrated pest management of Varroa and small hive beetle from BTune, the new beekeeping educational platform. So we have almost 500 subscribers to the webinar, mainly from North America, as we have seen, but also from the other side of the pond here in Europe. So let's get started. My name is Miguel Ángel Rodriguez, and I am Marketing and Business Development Head for Beto Pharma. And today we have the pleasure of having a magnificent speaker of recognized international prestige, Dr. Cameron Jack. Thank you, Cameron, for sharing this time with us. So before moving on to the presentation, I would like to explain the dynamics of the webinar and share a brief bio of our speaker. So the presentation lasts approximately 40-45 minutes. Right after, we will have a short Q&A session of about 15 minutes with the questions that you will be typing in the chat during the webinar. So don't forget to ask any question to our speaker. Anyway, any question that cannot be answered during the event, we will try to answer them later, so don't worry. So Cameron Jack is from a small farming community northeast Las Vegas, Nevada. His grandpa was a sideliner beekeeper, so Cameron grew up around honeybees and beekeeping. He traveled across the country to pursue a PhD at the University of Florida under the mentorship of Dr. Jamie Ellis, where he began investigating methods to control Varroa destructor, a devastating honeybee pest. In 2018, Cameron was hired on as a teaching faculty at the University of Florida and has been obsessed with creating a premier educational program that prepares students for the many challenges associated with beekeeping. So he currently teaches 9 honeybee-related courses and has created an online beekeeping certificate program at both the undergraduate and graduate level. So in 2021, he transitioned into an assistant professor position where he continues to teach and conduct research focused on pesticides, pathogens, and parasites that affect honeybees. So that's all from my side. Cameron, the stage is yours. Go ahead.
All right. Thank you so much, Miguel. And again, thanks for inviting me out for this. This is really exciting to have this platform now. Any way that we can give more information and share more information with each other is a good thing, in my opinion. And I'm happy to help and be part of it. So I was invited to speak to you all about integrated pest management, and this is something that I feel pretty passionate about as a topic because I feel like it's really misunderstood, right? A lot of people just equate IPM to kind of chemical-free treatment, and that's actually not what it means. And so I try to put this into a honeybee beekeeping context by using Varroa and small hive beetles as an example. So, you know, some of it might be applicable to you, no matter, I mean, we've got people from all over the world that are listening. So some of you might have small hive beetles as a problem. Some of you might not. Pretty much anywhere you are in the world, you've got Varroa as an issue. So hopefully something will be useful for you as you're learning about IPM and as we kind of talk about some of the control methods. So again, my purpose with this presentation, I just want to make sure I say this at the beginning. The purpose of this presentation is not to cover all the different management techniques for Varroa and for small hive beetles. It's to teach you integrated pest management principles using Varroa and small hive beetles as examples. So let's go ahead and jump in. I think this will make more sense as we get going. So just very basic beginnings. Let's just define IPM. So integrated pest management is simply just an approach to pest or pathogen control that uses a bunch of different control tactics. And the whole idea is that you're trying to minimize the impact to the environment and to the area, to the community, right? So again, the real key word here is combination. We're using lots of different things, and we're not just choosing all sorts of random things willy-nilly. We're choosing them based on need and based on risk. So I'll explain that here in a minute. But really, when it comes down to it, there's 4 pillars, 4 basic building blocks of IPM. So these different steps will start with setting some economic decision levels. So I told you we're not just doing things willy-nilly, we're doing them based on numbers. So there's some numbers involved in IPM. And then second, we're going to be, you have to have a good system to be able to identify and monitor. So you have to be able to sample the population to have some confidence in your decision making. And then actually a big part of IPM that I think is the forgotten step is how you can prevent and avoid having the pest become a problem in the first place. Now, a lot of you are already saying like, well, Cameron, Varroa, that ship has sailed, right? True to some degree, right? But we're going to talk about it theoretically, and into some ways that you can kind of prevent reinfestation. So, but that is kind of step number three, and then the final step is actually moving towards methods that use control, and then there are different levels of control. So we'll spend most of our time on that fourth step, but I want to make sure that we set the foundation on these other parts of IPM before we get to just talking about control methods. So let's talk about that first step. So this is our economic decision levels. And this is, again, this is important for us to start here because the numbers are what drives all the decisions that we're going to make. And so there are actually two different economic decision levels that we use in IPM. The first one is called the economic injury level. So this kind of most generally speaking, and its most basic level, I mean, we consider the economic injury level to be the break-even point. So this is where the cost of controlling the pest is equal to the economic damage, right? So you're not making any money at this level. This is your break-even point, right? You're not making money, you're not losing money. So we need to have that level established so that we can set a second level of decision level called the economic threshold, or sometimes it's called the action threshold. And this is when it becomes prudent for you to take some action so you don't hit that economic injury level. I've got my little pointer here so you can see this illustration a little better. Notice that the economic threshold is always going to be below the economic injury level. Because if this red line is our pest population, over time, your pest population is going to increase. And then when it hits a certain threshold, that economic threshold, that's when you're applying a certain kind of treatment to reduce the pest populations, to kind of keep them below. So, because if we let the pest populations grow and they exceed that economic injury level, we're losing money. And so we don't want to lose money, but we don't, I guess a fundamental difference between an IPM mindset and then like kind of our historical thought process of control is that we're not trying to eradicate the pest. We have to really come to grips with this, people. We're not going to eradicate Varroa. We're not going to eradicate small hive beetle. It's about managing them in a way that still is profitable, but still preserves the different tools that we have for control and keeps our environment and our bees safe, right? So that's the whole idea with IPM, and that's the idea with these economic injury level and the economic threshold. So to implement IPM successfully, you need to be able to identify what pests or pathogens you might have, and be able to recognize like the signs of it. So this is going to require some good monitoring, and you will need to be able to find some cost-effective ways to apply some controls to bring those down. Now, there are I'm going to refer later on in this presentation to a article that Jamie Ellis and I wrote related to IPM, where I give some kind of examples related to the numbers, which I'm not including in this presentation now, primarily because it's not a perfect fit. IPM works, if you think of like an acre of strawberries, I can calculate exactly how many strawberries I might expect to get, and I can calculate, what that damage might do. Like if I have a mite pest, like two-spotted spider mites, for instance, if I knew how many mites I had per acre, I could probably estimate my reduced strawberry load and like a monetary value or a monetary decrease, right? Like that's just difficult to do in a honeybee colony situation. You know, 100 mites per colony, what does that mean? Does that mean that your bees were going to make 30 pounds of honey, but now they can only make, just a few pounds? It's really difficult. It's not something that we can calculate easily. So I didn't put it in this presentation, but if you're curious about the formulas of how to calculate those economic injury levels, feel free to refer back to that paper, and I'll reference that at the towards the end of this presentation. Um, but as I mentioned, you have to have, in order to be able to think clearly about integrated pest management, you not only need to understand the concepts of applying a treatment, but in order to know where that pest populations are at, you have to be able to monitor them effectively. So I'm just giving you a couple of examples, and I'm not necessarily going to spend a lot of time on this because we got an audience here from all over the world, and people do this in different ways. I think the most important thing is that what you are doing, it is standardized, and it's something that you can have some level of confidence in what you're saying. So let me give you a couple of examples from the United States. It's not from the United States. People do it all over the world, but something that is commonly used, and from where I'm from, is powder sugar shakes, where you are collecting a sample of about 300 bees. You are placing like icing sugar or powdered sugar on those bees. You're rolling them around. This causes the bees to groom themselves. They're going to be kind of going crazy in this situation and knocking off those mites. The mites basically have little suction cups for feet. And so having the powdered sugar on them kind of makes it so they can't hold on, and the bees are grooming, and so the mites can come off. So this kind of gives you a way, you can kind of flip this jar upside down, give it a gentle shake, allow the mites to pass through some mesh, and while keeping the bees inside the jar. This has some pros and cons. The pro is it's pretty quick, it's pretty easy. I guess the major con is that you're not 100% certain that you have actually removed all of these mites from this jar. So it's just kind of a way to help you estimate the number of mites that you might have in a sample. Personally, I much prefer the alcohol wash method of testing mite infestation, which means you're collecting a sample of about 300 bees. I take these from the brood area where I can actively see bees emerging. That's where I'm really targeting. If I have a section of comb that has drones emerging, even better. That kind of gives me an idea of maybe a little bit more of what my mite loads are, because you might expect to see more mites in the drone brood area. But the goal is you're looking for these bees in these areas, and you're using something like rubbing alcohol, like isopropyl alcohol, which the reason I like to use alcohol rather than something like soapy water, some people can have used soapy water before, is because I can collect a bunch of samples in the field in alcohol, and then I can take them back to my house, and then I can wash them and do the rest. If I do it in soapy water and I leave them even overnight, well, it's going to be gross and it's going to be stinky, and you're not going to want to do that. So alcohol wash is kind of, it kills the bees very quickly. You shake it for about 30 seconds. Then I have a honey sieve that I have like dedicated to my alcohol washes. So I can pour those pour those bees through. I can just give them a gentle rinse with water. The mites will collect on the bottom part of the sieve, and the bees will remain on the top. And this just allows me to, make my counts. I prefer the alcohol wash method for my monitoring strategy, because I know for certain that I have removed all the mites per bees. If I have any questions about it, let's say I get a lot of mites down in the bottom, I can put all those bees back into the container, wash them again, and then like shake them again in water and then continue that process until I see no more mites. So I can feel confident that I've removed all the mites from that sample. So that is these are two ways that you can kind of confidently have an idea of your mite infestation level. Now, mite fall is the practice of letting is kind of a more of a passive technique where you are either putting a sticky board kind of underneath the colony, or if your hive is equipped with a screen bottom board, then you can put that board underneath. The idea is that the mites are naturally going to fall down as the bees are grooming them, and you can kind of get a count. Now, from the research that I have done, I don't believe that mite fall is particularly accurate or doesn't give you an accurate estimate of your mite populations. I think there's a place for it, especially when we're using maybe like some kind of a chemical control or something, and you want to see if that chemical is knocking mites down, then mite fall is really great. But if this is just a way that you are monitoring Varroa, I don't think it gives you a very accurate count, and I would recommend that you use something else. So again, a pillar of IPM is being able to monitor your mites effectively, or monitor your pests, because unfortunately for small hive beetles, there's not an accurate way to consistently monitor for small hive beetles. You know, we can put in traps or something for beetles, but we can't really correlate. You know, if I find 10 beetles in the trap, that means I have 100 beetles in my colony. It doesn't really work like that. And so unfortunately, this is one area that's really lacking, and I think some research needs to continue to be done, but we'll have to be creative about it because thus far, it doesn't seem to be as straightforward as Varroa estimates are. Okay, so let's keep going now with our kind of down this hole. Let's say that we have monitored and we have our estimate. If we were using Varroa as an example, we have some economic injury levels that are kind of arbitrarily put in place. Again, keeping in mind that there is a formula to calculate economic injury level. It just has a lot to do with the cost of treatments and the expected amount of injury, and that's what we can't quite measure yet, at least not easily with honeybee colonies, because I can't tell you that, three mites per 100 bees is going to result in a 20% economic loss. Like, right, we can't quite do that. But based on I think it's a little bit arbitrary, but it's based on years of experience, and I've found that these numbers do tend to ring true for me. Is for these economic injury levels, we do have some idea, and I'm taking this figure directly from the Honeybee Health Coalition, their tools for Varroa management. So I'm not trying to pass this off on as my own, but I think this is a helpful table because depending on the time of the year and the size of your honeybee colony, it can kind of affect the economic injury level that you might have, and the amount of mites that your colony can withstand. So for instance, during the summer and you are at peak population, right, your mite levels that you can handle before it really becomes a problem could be, at about 5%. But most of the year, when your colonies are in that growth phase, or even when they're in the declining phase, once you have reached that about 3 mites per 100 bee level, you really need to do something. And again, this is not really a Varroa biology talk, so I'm not getting into the biology of the mite or anything like that. But really, the reason that you want to control these mite levels before they get too high really has little to do with the mite itself, but more to do with the viruses that these mites can vector and transmit to your bees. And so when you have high mite populations, you have really high virus levels, and those virus levels is what makes your bees sick. So this is some examples of some economic injury levels that we could set for ourselves. And then we would need to collect some kind of some of our own data related to these economic thresholds. So that, again, that is when you are applying a treatment before you reach that economic injury level, right? If you think back to that figure, you're applying the economic threshold or the treatment before you reach that mark. So we're going to start talking about these layers of control. And you might have seen this before if you've heard anybody give a lecture about IPM before. I promise you've seen some kind of a pyramid that looks like this, because this is the way that we've commonly talked about it for years and years. But I think it's a good way to think about it, because just like in a pyramid, you have the base layers are going to be kind of more important so that you can continue to stack on. But notice the color gradient change. From the beginning, it's easy for us to do some prevention, but it becomes more risky the higher we go, and the higher we go up this pyramid, right? So there are basically 4 categories. We're going to talk about prevention because I already told you prevention is kind of its own step. But when we're talking about control, we're really in these 4 categories of cultural, mechanical, biological, and chemical controls. Now, I'm a teacher. I told you I mostly have teaching appointment. So I'm going to stop for a second. I'm going to give a pop quiz because I don't want anybody's eyes glazing over during this lecture. So really quick, we're thinking back to our monitoring strategies. Which of these is not a monitoring tool for Varroa? We'll let you answer with a poll. All right, so there's the poll. I'll give you a few seconds. Which of these is not a monitoring tool for Varroa? Three, two, one. Okay, hopefully you've got your answers in. We can check on that or show some results. We'll figure out how to show those results in a minute. But hopefully almost everybody chose C, right? Powdered cocoa shake. As delicious as that sounds, is not a monitoring tool for Varroa. And if you put cocoa on your bees, they're not going to be happy with you. And they're probably going to let you know about how that displeases them. All right, let's keep going. All right, so let's get back in here. So prevention. So that is that base layer of our pyramid. And as I said before, it's often the forgotten step in integrated pest management. But it's so important, because we can do things, once we have the pest. But what's so much cheaper than getting the pest and less dangerous is preventing the pest from arriving in the first place. So this is especially on my mind a lot as I live in the state of Florida, where we are surrounded by ports in all of our major Florida cities, where things are constantly coming in. And so at least in the United States, if there's an introduction of some kind of new terrible pest or pathogen, it's probably coming through Florida. We just have a lot of ports, a lot of people. So this is just something that's really on my mind, but it's definitely been on my mind a lot recently in the Varroa world anyways, as as we've had this introduction of Varroa into Australia. There's been so many questions and people thinking about this, and I've had an opportunity to travel to Australia in the last year and to see the amount of effort and attention they put into prevention is actually really incredible. So if you are in an area, especially throughout the world, wherever you are, if you're in an area that's close to the coast or where there's constantly close to ports, you need to be kind of on another level of inspection and making sure that some of these pests that are coming in to your area that you're watching for. Some examples of prevention in honeybees like that are currently going. Varroa has been around for a while, right? But Tropicalaps, is another mite species that can be incredibly devastating. And so this is something that, most of the world should be on high alert for, especially if you live in one of these areas that are close to a coastline, that you're keeping an eye out for. Unwanted genetics, so African honeybees could be another example of good prevention techniques. Even as simple as wax moths. Wax moths are throughout the whole world, right? And so you might say, oh, well, we're going to get wax moths. Well, yes and no, right? Wax moths are the classic example of prevention. If you use good techniques as you are storing your combs, you can prevent wax moth infestation. So even though they are present, you are preventing them from coming into your boxes and making trouble, right? So these are just some simple examples of prevention. If you think about Varroa, again, I told you that I'm using Varroa and small hive beetles as ways to teach IPM. So let's think of some examples. Now, again, you're thinking Varroa, that ship has sailed. We all have Varroa. We can't prevent it. So this is not true anymore, but 15 years ago, we were able to, at least in the United States, we could get bees from places that did not have Varroa, such as Australia at the time, right? We could purchase and bring in bees into our areas from Varroa-free resources, or from Varroa-free places. That's not the case anymore, but that's just an example of prevention. Another example of prevention that I think is pertinent to every beekeeper throughout the whole world is this idea of controlling swarming. Because you might think, what does that have to do with prevention? Well, if you are preventing your bees from swarming and just, making colonies all over in your area that are unmanaged, then first of all, if you're letting swarms go all the time, your neighbors hate you. But second of all, if you're doing that, you have all these reservoir colonies, these colonies that are unmanaged. They probably have high mite loads, and you're continually getting reinfested. So a good example of prevention is don't allow all those feral colonies to be all around you, right? The last thing you could do is an example could be that you are treating bees as they are coming in. People do this in the United States with oxalic acid. Some do it with powdered sugar. I've done it with both. I kind of feel that it's a little bit stressful on the bees, and so maybe not what I would do, but simply an example of prevention. So now you can't say, Cameron, prevention doesn't make sense with Varroa. Here are some examples that it could help to prevent reinfestation into your apiaries. All right, so now let's move on to our next step. This is our cultural controls. Now, a cultural control means that you are changing the environment to make it less suitable for that pest or pathogen, right? And the whole idea is that you're trying to minimally impact the environment, but making it less suitable for the pest. So this is usually a preemptive measure, but it doesn't have to be. I could get Varroa and then I could replace my queen with hygienic stock. So if you're wondering, if you have never seen an image like this before, this is an example of something called a freeze kill brood assay. It's a way that queen breeders can, there's other methods, but one of the ways that they can select for bees with hygienic traits. So they put maybe a PVC pipe and we'll maybe pour in a little bit of liquid nitrogen, flash freezing and killing all the brood that are in that area. Then they come back within 24 hours and they measure the percentage of dead brood that has been removed. And so you can see from this image, this was a very hygienic colony. Within a short amount of time, 24 hours, they have found the problem. They found those bees that are dead. They have removed them. And so this is one way that they can select for hygienic traits. Now, these hygienic traits are an example of a cultural control because you're changing the environment. The bees themselves are able to detect when the Varroa might be present and remove that mite or remove that disease or infested bee and get rid of it, thereby keeping the populations low. Another example of a cultural control, again, changing the environment, could be like forcing a brood break inside of your colony. If you know about Varroa biology, right, they can only reproduce down inside those honeybee brood cells. So if you can stop like honeybee production by caging the queen, you've in sense made that environment unsuitable for the pest. Now it's also unsuitable for your bees, so it's not like you can just leave your queen cage for really, really long periods of time, but it's a tactic that you could use to stop Varroa reproduction, and then it's often combined with other treatments to kill mites quickly. So these are two examples of Varroa related cultural control, but there are also some examples I can think of small hive beetle cultural controls. And again, comes down to using hygienic stock. This is a picture I took from Jamie Ellis with some work that he had done years ago, where he had he put like some cages on a brood area where he confined some beetles to one cage where the bees were not able to get in there and harm the beetles, and you can see the areas where the beetles were kept out. So this side is all glistening and shiny and slimy and gross, where this side, is kind of more of our typical brood area. And so the reason that it's slimy and gross is because the beetles have a yeast that are associated with their bodies that causes fermentation, and so that's where that sliminess kind of comes from. But if you have hygienic bee stock, it's been shown that they can in fact remove small hive beetle eggs, kind of prevent those large small hive beetle outbreaks. So if you're in an area where you tend to get those outbreaks, it's another reason that a good breeding with some hygienic stock could really be a nice cultural control for both Varroa and small hive beetles for your colony. Another example of cultural controls, again, changing the environment for small hive beetles is maintaining your colonies in areas where they get a lot of sun and that soil is maybe hard and compacted, and it's difficult for those beetles to pupate. So these are just examples, changing the environment. Let's move on now to our mechanical controls. So mechanical controls mean you're doing some kind of abiotic change to the environment, or physically removing these pests from the colony. So this and mechanical control could be as simple as taking some infested brood and that has lots of larvae in it, and you move it into the freezer, instantly killing all the beetle larvae, right? We use traps for beetles. I'm just putting on a couple of pictures of examples, but there's dozens of different small hive beetle traps that are out there in the world. But even as simple as just physically removing or smashing your beetles is an example of a mechanical control. I know this sounds absolutely crazy, but we as researchers, I have the opposite problem of most beekeepers in the world, is that I cannot get enough Varroa. I cannot get enough small hive beetles, that I have to try my best to rear them kind of separately so I can do my experiments, right? So one of the things that we have found that actually works, believe it or not, really great at small hive beetle control is we bring out an aspirator. I don't know if you've ever seen these. It's like used for collecting insects, where it's basically little vacuums that you're sucking in. You're the vacuum, and you can suck up small hive beetles. Oh man, because we need to collect beetles alive. But we go into an infested colony, we just start sucking up beetles, and we can clean up that hive really quick. Of course, it's a pain in the neck. I know that it's not realistic at all for people that have really more than just a few colonies. But if you're just a hobbyist beekeeper with a few colonies in your backyard, go try it. Get an aspirator, suck those beetles up. You can feed them to your chickens or whatever, but it's a good way to get rid of a lot of beetles very quickly. But these are all examples of a mechanical control. On the Varroa side of things, if we were trying to use a mechanical control, we might think of screen bottom boards. Again, you're doing something to allow the mites to pass through, right? As I kind of already mentioned a little bit earlier, as these mites are more attracted or more partial to drone brood, you can use that to your advantage by either removing sections of drone brood or trapping them with some kind of drone comb removal, right? You're doing something to physically remove the pest, and that's the purpose of a mechanical control. the drone comb removal has actually been shown to be really incredibly effective. I mean, there's a paper by David Tarpey out of NC State years ago where they were found that they could remove 95% of the mites in one fell swoop with drone comb removal. I mean, if it's right and the conditions are right and you have lots of drones that are all the same age, it can really be effective. So keep that in mind. There are some other examples of kind of abiotic changes that can work and not work. I've used small smell foundation because otherwise people will ask me about it, but it's not really effective. But people still ask about it. But that would be an example of a mechanical control. It means you're making you're causing an abiotic change in that colony. But another example could be like hyperthermia, which means that's the opposite of hypothermia, right? Hypothermia means you're really cold. Hyperthermia means you're making that colony really warm. And the temperature that kills your Varroa, it has to be maintained for a couple of hours. So it's kind of difficult to do. And I'm not an early adopter of new technology, so I'm still letting other people come up with different technologies, but it's something that can potentially work. You just have to be very, very careful with it because the temperature that kills your mites and the temperature that kills your brood are really close to each other. And so obviously if you don't want to kill all your brood, then you need to be paying close attention. But these are just examples of some mechanical controls doing something to physically kill or remove. Let's move on to our biological controls. So our biological controls means that we are using one organism to control another organism, right? This has been kind of met with mixed reactions because in some cases it has worked incredibly well. In some cases it has caused other problems, right? So this is it's a long process to be able to find a pest and go through the safety checks before you would ever bring a different kind of organism into your area, especially if it's not native to that area. But it has been shown to be somewhat effective, at least for small hive beetles, right? Because this is where it's a little bit tricky and where we've really kind of stalled on a lot of our biological controls for honeybee pests is that honeybee colonies are actually really good at keeping out other organisms, right? They don't let a lot of things into their hive. And so there's not necessarily natural predators or natural pathogens to some of these species because the bees are very hygienic and they're very good at keeping things out. So here's some examples of things that can work with small hive beetles anyways, is using something like an entomopathogenic fungi, using as the larva and as the pupa go down into the soil, there could be nematodes that get into the larva, kill them, and then are released back into the ground. There's been people that have looked for arthropod predators, but that has not really been particularly successful. I will say at this point, all of these are examples of biological controls that can work fairly well inside of the laboratory setting, but have not really proven to be particularly effective in the field. At least not yet. People are working on them, working on different strains of entomopathogenic fungi that are a bit more hardy and can hang on and survive in those warm climates of a honeybee colony. Some people are working more on nematodes. So there are things that are coming down the pike that I feel like are at least exciting, but we're not really there yet. And even more so, we're not there yet with Varroa. There are some, again, cool examples of things that work in a petri dish inside of a lab. You know, I can spray a fungus on those Varroa and they will die. But if I spray it onto the whole colony, you know, it doesn't really work. It doesn't really make its way to the mite. You can find predators that will eat Varroa, such as pseudoscorpions, such as Stradiolaelaps mites. Problem is once they're inside of a honeybee colony, there's lots of issues, lots of noise, lots of things going around, lots of bees. It just doesn't seem to work. And so at this point, biological controls do not really seem as a viable control method for Varroa. All right, now before we go on, we've got another pop quiz. So which of these 5 options here are not examples of a mechanical control? So you got screen bottom boards, drone comb removal, resistant queen stock, drone removal, or hyperthermia. So which of these are not an example of mechanical control? And I'll give you 5 seconds as I get a drink. 2, 1. Okay, so let's see. Oh, good. We got some results on this one. All right. So the correct answer was the resistant queen stock, right? That would be an example of a cultural control, not a mechanical control. So hopefully that is what everybody answered. Because the rest of the resistant queen stock would mean you are changing the environment versus the other ones where you are enacting some kind of abiotic change or or physically removing the pest, right? All right, good. I hope we're all square on that point. Let's move on to our last section here. And before we do, I want to point out, look, when we're talking about chemical controls, we are breaking these up into 2 different sections. You have natural chemicals and synthetic chemicals. And they're both at the top of this pyramid. But let's start talking about natural chemicals first. But there are some things, I mean, people that have heard me talk about chemicals before have seen this image, but at least had me get on my soapbox for just a minute because I feel strongly about this. Natural chemicals are not necessarily safe, not for your bees, not for you. Just because a chemical is natural does not mean it's safe. So you need to be sure that you're always following the label. You're protecting yourself, you're protecting your bees, because the label is not only the law in whatever country you're in, but the label represents research that has been done. And so it's important to know. The last thing, and we've kind of talked about this, at least just mentioned it earlier, a kind of a pillar of IPM and control means you are using a combination of techniques and rotating them, right? So we have a really bad habit, not just as beekeepers, but kind of throughout agriculture and medicine in general, is that we tend to get really fixed on one thing and we use it over and over and over and over until it becomes resistant, right? And so if you don't rotate your chemical treatments, your mites are going to develop resistance. Even there's a potential that there could be for even natural chemicals. But the reason we had natural chemicals below as a lower risk than before some of the synthetic chemicals really has more to do with the way that these chemicals break down. And most natural chemicals break down in the environment very quickly. Now, I've got a list here of some of these natural chemicals. This talk is not really about endorsing it or any kind of chemical. My point is just kind of teaching here. But know that there are a lot of different things here. I'm kind of giving you some basics and not trying to talk about necessarily any products here, just kind of giving you some basics. So oxalic acid is an example of a natural chemical. It comes extracted from plants. It breaks down very quickly. I just pointing these out. This is true for all of them. I'm just pointing out for oxalic acid, especially, this is an example of a chemical that you would want to make sure that you are taking care of yourself. Just because it's natural does not make it safe, right? Cover your skin, protect your eyes, protect your lungs. If you're vaporizing it, like shown here, which is legal in some countries, it is in the United States and is common in the United States, then you would need to wear a respirator that actually filters organic vapors, not just a simple plastic cloth mask that we kind of wore during COVID. Like this is going to be, you would need something very, very strict to be able to keep that out. I promise you, it's not something you want to breathe in. Now, some of these other active ingredients that are found in some other products like thymol, formic acid, hot beta acids, these are products that, again, they're natural. They will break down kind of a result of the fact that these are water soluble, they break down rather quickly, is that most of these treatments are short lasting. They're kind of a one-time treatment. You get an effect. There are different formulations. Like for instance, like thymol, there's different formulations that can make it last longer. Formic acid, same thing. Oxalic acid, all of these. There are ways that we can try our best to extend it, but they break down quickly. Now that means they're not going to have a long lasting effect, which means you're probably going to have to apply it multiple times over and over. But that's where it comes in handy that you are monitoring your populations so that you can keep an eye on them. Okay, essential oils, I kind of mentioned them at the bottom here because there are lots of different essential oils. Depending on where you are in the world, you have maybe access to different ones. And there are a million questions and a lot of research being done in this area, but it's hard for me to boil them down any further than I've really got the time for here. So, and last, we'll talk about the synthetic chemical controls. I know I'm going to be running out of time here, so I'm going to move quickly. But let's use small hive beetles as an example here for some of our synthetic chemical controls. There are two of them that, at least in the United States, that are registered. I don't necessarily endorse either of them, and don't think either of them are particularly great. But one of them, the active ingredient is permethrin, is used around the base of the, like, it's a ground drench, like around the base of the hive. I guess the difference for natural chemicals that are water soluble, that break down very quickly, synthetic chemicals are meant to last, to hang around. So that's why it's kind of your last resort, because it is kind of hard on the environment. It is kind of hard on your bees. It can make your bees sick. However, I'm not saying that I am anti-synthetic chemicals. In fact, we use them. It just needs to be part of your plan, and I have to have justification based on my mite populations or my beetle populations before I'm using these kind of synthetic chemicals, right? So permethrin's a ground drench. Coumaphos, which is the active ingredient that's found in checkmite, is a legal way to apply it. The small hive beetles are very resistant to Coumaphos, so I'm not suggesting that you use it. I'm just giving you an example. That's a thing you've heard me say lots of times. For you're using this as Varroa, there are a few different synthetic chemical treatments. I am telling you what is in the United States, knowing fully that in other countries there are other products with other active ingredients, but in the United States we have really basically three things. We have a pyrethroid, the active ingredient is taofluvalinate, and the product Apistan. Everybody was using it in the 80s when Varroa arrived into the United States, and because everybody was using it, they quickly became resistant to it. Next came checkmite, the active ingredient of Coumaphos. Everybody was using it, and very quickly, within just a few years, mites became resistant to it. Lastly, we've been using the active ingredient amitraz, found in the product Apivar. We've been using it for a very long time. Everybody's been using it in the United States, and now we're seeing lots of resistance. So I'm not putting these X's in here to knock on these products per se. It's more of a reminder for you as the listener, that if we use the same thing over and over, I promise we're going to run into issues. So this is why, as part of IPM, we are rotating our different chemical treatments. These strips are super convenient, and I realize that we like that, but good IPM practices are not always super convenient, but it is worth it for your wallet. Now, before I move on, I've got one last quiz for you. So which of these molecules are not a natural chemical treatment that are used for Varroa control? Whoops, let me put that poll up. All right. So is it oxalic acid, thymol, amitraz, hot beta acids? Which of them are not a natural chemical treatment? Said that as slow and awkward as I could make it, because that's kind of how I am. All right. I hope you got the answer to this one. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. I'm going to click off that. We'll see if we see you should know the correct answer here is amitraz, right? This is our, this is a formamidine. This is an example of a synthetic chemical. Amitraz is long lasting. It does break down into a breakdown product, but that breakdown product stays inside of a honeybee colony for a very long time. Okay, so let's move on to just to wrap this up so we have a little bit of time for questions. Last thing I'm going to say is that integrated pest management is good for your bees, and it's also good for your wallet, meaning that you will save money in the long term. I realize that some of these things like monitoring, actually going out and sampling and looking what your mite populations are at, that costs you time, and time is money, right? But in the long run, it preserves these treatment efficacies, which saves everybody's it saves everybody money. And and if you are actually monitoring your pest populations before and after treatment, you will be treating only when it is necessary. That is what's going to, it's also going to help save you money. I think that's a major problem that so many of us have, is that we don't go back and check to see what our mite populations are. So the last thing I'll kind of put up on the screen is we've got, this was that article that I was referring to at the beginning, that there are some, Jamie Ellis and I wrote this article related to integrated pest management, where we have kind of a thorough explanation of all the Varroa research that has kind of been done in the last 70 years. And we try to put this in a framework, that an IPM framework that will hopefully be helpful for many people. So I hope you take a look at it and it's useful for you. Here's my email if you have questions. If I can't get to it today, then feel free to reach out. We also have lots of resources as our at our UF Honeybee Lab website. Of course, many of you know that Jamie Ellis and Amy Vu have a podcast called Two Bees in a Podcast. It would be really great. It's got a lot of great information. We interview people from all over the country, so you should check that out, and if you haven't heard that as well. So with that, I will stop talking for just a minute, and maybe we can get to some of these questions. Miguel,
Yep.
were you planning on reading some of them, or should I?
Yeah, I will.
Okay.
I will read them for you. So thank you very much for your presentation, Cameron. I think we have some people just sharing some thoughts. So I will start with the first one. So Anthony, thanks for sharing different questions. So the first one is: do you think Darwinian beekeeping, as outlined by Dr. Tom Seeley in his research, could be part of the basis for IPM beekeeping approaches before using treatments or in conjunction with using treatments?
So, great question. And I will tell you that, in my opinion, this idea of kind of the Darwinian beekeeping, meaning that, right, like we're kind of allowing the bees to kind of self-select and for those traits that are good for them. This idea of natural selection could be, we've got these pest pressures like Varroa, like small hive beetles, that if we just kind of let them die, and the ones that kind of phase out, the colonies that can't handle it, and only the ones that survive, those remaining colonies, are the ones that have the right genetics to handle it. I get that argument. And personally, in my opinion, I don't necessarily think that is the right way to go. And it doesn't really fit quite within the IPM framework, in the sense that you're going to let a lot of bees die, first of all. Second of all, we have a bee here that is very domesticated, right? We have over hundreds of years, we have kind of helped shaped bees by breeding them for certain traits that we like. We want bees that are gentle. We want bees that are good honey producers, right? We want bees that build up their brood rapidly so that we can make those spring honey flows. Those are all these traits that we're wanting, and we've kind of bred into them versus kind of that natural selection approach of just letting them sort it out themselves and dying. So in my opinion, I don't know that it's necessarily part of IPM. I think it's a different style, a whole different mindset of beekeeping. But yeah, it's not a knock on it. That's just how I feel. I don't know that it necessarily fits into this same framework.
Okay, we have another question coming from Nelda. Can you say more about why sticky board counts are not considered accurate? Is there a paper you can recommend?
Yes. So so Nelda, first of all, I know you sent me some emails and I owe you an email. So because you asked me this question before and I'm a little bit behind on emails, but I haven't forgotten. I'm just getting into it. This is great. I have an opportunity to talk to you about it right here. So sticky boards, the reason that I say there are some papers that have shown this, and including some of my own, where when we are monitoring our Varroa populations and like through alcohol washes and sticky boards simultaneously, what we will see is that over time, as our mite populations are growing, our sticky board levels are staying flat. They're not growing along with our mite infestation levels. And we see this is especially true when we are actively treating. So for example, I have a paper that I could share with you where when we applied a chemical treatment, we are applying oxalic acid vapor, for instance, once a week for 4 weeks in a row. And what we would see is every time we would apply that chemical treatment, within 72 hours, we'd have really high mite fall. But then after 72 hours, the mites would come back down and it would kind of level out. But even over time, over each week, our mites were reducing as we were using these treatments, but our mite drop never really reduced and never really changed. It was stayed consistent kind of regardless of whether we had high mites, low mites. So in my opinion, it's not a good, accurate way to really assess what is going on. Like I said before, I think there's a place for mite drop. I think it helps you see when you're applying a specific chemical what's happening, but it doesn't necessarily give you consistent results over time.
Okay, we have another question from John Gott. So while I have seen resistance to amitrate in operations using amitrate on shop towel of label, I have not seen resistance in operation using Apivar and rotation treatments. Is there documented resistance when Apivar is used in accordance with the label, which includes rotation of treatments?
Yes, it's a great question. So yes, has been documented evidence of that, just even with using Apivar. But I think it has more to do with the amount of time that people are using it, their repeated usage of that chemical. That's really what becomes the problem is when we are kind of, we had mentioned Darwinian beekeeping a minute ago. This comes back to this idea of natural selection. When you are putting a pressure on, a consistent pressure, it kind of forces that pest. It's going to remove all the pests from the environment that are susceptible to that chemical. And then the ones that survive are the ones that are going to keep reproducing, and then that all of a sudden your population is resistant. So even with Apivar, if there was continued use of Apivar over and over, then it could be considered a problem. So that's why, coming back to this whole idea of integrated pest management, we need to have multiple tools in our toolbox that we can rotate our treatment so that we're not doing the same thing.
Okay, so we have another question from Adam Hitman, very related to the previous one. So do you see beekeepers using the right products for Varroa, but not applying them correctly? And how much does this alter the efficacy of the treatment?
Yeah, great question. So yes, that is certainly an issue. And I've seen some products are a little bit more intense. Like for instance, products that contain formic acid, right? This is something that is really, you have to follow that label very carefully, or else you really can hurt your bees and knock down your bees if you're if you're not using it according to the label. Same thing with even with Amatraz, right? If I read the label and it says use 2 strips per brood chamber, but I decide, well, 2 is good, 4 must be better, I'm going to use 4 strips per brood chamber. You're potentially going to hurt your bees. You have to keep in mind that we are trying to control an arthropod that's on another arthropod, right? Like the chemicals that are toxic to the mite or to the beetle are also toxic to the honeybee. It's all about the right dose. And if you go away from that label and you're using too much chemical, then you do have a chance of hurting your bees. And I have seen it happen. Primarily with off-labeled stuff, but it's usually, or when people have used the label or labeled product, but they're just using it incorrectly. So it can happen.
Okay, we have another question from Noat. Do we rotate treatment from year to year or within the same year from season to season?
Good question. So this comes down to knowing maybe a little bit more about like Varroa biology, in the sense that you will have these different groups of mites, and so I don't necessarily think you need to say, okay, well, I'm only going to use Amatraz this year, but I won't use it next year. I think a year is a pretty long time to see some turnover in mites. However, even season to season is probably a little much. So I would probably recommend, again, this is going to be something that you determine based on your sampling and knowing your own mite populations. But I would try my best to not use the same treatment. And I promise you, we try to practice what we preach here at the university. So with our colonies that we maintain for research, some of them we have to keep very healthy and have very few mites. And to do that, we try not to use the same thing over and over. We might use oxalic acid once in the winter, but then we'll try not to use it again until maybe later in the year, or even or maybe just keep it as our winter treatment, and then we are using something else in the spring, like formic acid. We're using something like Amatraz maybe in the summer or the fall, right? We're trying our best to use multiple tactics, but to really keep an eye on your mite levels is key to the whole thing, because otherwise, then you would have to just keep you'll just use the same thing that you think is most effective, but you won't know, right? You don't know if it worked or not. So yeah, that's why rotating and monitoring so important.
Okay, we have another question from Robert Stevens. So in your opinion, will honeybees eventually become resistant to oxalic acid?
Will honeybees or Varroa become resistant to oxalic acid? So honeybees themselves, right? There could be some damage with oxalic acid, but breeding, this is the kind of the tricky part with bees becoming resistant themselves, is because really the selection is happening kind of at the queen level, right? Not necessarily at the individual worker levels, because you would have to have a queen that is laying some workers that are more hardy and maybe can handle that. If you're talking about the point, can Varroa eventually become resistant to oxalic acid? The answer is yes, if we were using the same, like it doesn't matter if it's just because it's natural, right? The point is if there was enough pressure and we were using oxalic acid over and over and over, eventually we would find mites that are a small population of those mites that are not affected by the treatment, that are now the only ones left that are reproducing, and now you've got resistant mites to that chemical treatment. So definitely, I think any of these treatments that I talked about today, there could develop resistance towards them if it was something that was used in regularity.
Okay, I will add my own question if you don't mind. So
yeah, sure.
Continuous Varroa monitoring plays a key role in decision making. So is this a common practice among US commercial beekeepers, for example, or do you think there is still a gap to improve here?
Good question, Miguel. And absolutely, I think this is a gap to improve with beekeepers at all levels, because I think we tend to do things that are convenient for us, right? And so when even at the hobbyist level, if you just have a couple of colonies in your backyard, you don't always want to keep sampling them because that just takes time and might be something you don't want to do. I will say I am seeing more and more commercial beekeepers that are finally, in my opinion, that are getting it, like they're seeing the benefits of actually knowing their mite populations. Now, that's not to say that they're sampling every single colony. That would just for US beekeepers that have thousands of colonies under their management, that's just not possible or practical to do. But if they are sampling within that apiary and they're taking a representative sample of that apiary, then they can get a pretty good idea of what is going on, and they can make an apiary level decision of okay, now let's treat with this chemical at this time for all of them. And so they're kind of instead of managing bees colonies individually, they're kind of managing apiary levels of Varroa. So yeah, that is I think that is going to be something that is a trend that's going to continue. Hopefully, is that more and more people are going to see the benefit of doing this, but still a long ways to go, Miguel.
For sure, we all need to improve on that. We have a question from Thomas Babcock. How about new treatments like Amiflex and Baroxan?
Good questions. Yeah, these are all, I mean, I'm so excited that we have more options. Like I said, this is this talk wasn't really about the controls themselves. It was more about IPM and like how to integrate them. So I don't have like data to tell you about Varoxan or Amiflex or anything like that. But what I want to just hit home is just that, yes, good, glad that we have some things to rotate with, right? And to use different things, like, so for instance, Amiflex is intended to be a product that is used for like flash treatments to fit within windows when you normally wouldn't be able to use them. So that's great. Same with the Varoxan is intended to be an extended release oxalic acid to fit in times where you maybe wouldn't be able to do other kinds of treatments. So I'm encouraged that we have new products, and I'm encouraged that there are more products coming. This is what I want. This is why it's so important for me to talk about IPM, is like, as we see a release of these new products that are coming down the pike, if we have this mindset that we're not going to get hung up and just use one product over and over and over, like we kind of did with Amatraz and with all the other ones, if we have that mindset now, it's going to preserve these treatments and allow us to actually effectively manage the mites, instead of just continually scrambling to figure out what we're going to do next, right? We'll have different tools in our toolkit.
Okay, we still have some pending questions, but I think we are running out a little bit of time. So I hope everyone has enjoyed and learned something today. I think we all need to be aware of what are the tools available, and we need to use them wisely. So it's monitoring and rotation, what we basically learned from today. I would like to thank all the attendees for their participation in the chat, and of course our speaker today, Cameron, for his great educational capacity and for all the support in the development of this event from the beginning. So in the next few days, we will send you a link with the recording of the webinar. We are already working on the next webinars, which we hope will be as interesting as the one we held today. Thank you very much, everyone, and hope to see you soon.
Thanks again for having me.